Preston for you.
Got it. All right, so let me go back and share. And it doesn't want to, so sorry. These are the challenges we have using this.
What are you trying to share? Because we can still see I can still see the slides.
You
Me
can?
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. For some reason I cannot. Okay.
Skip to the next. Let me see.
All right, I got it. All right, we ready?
Yes.
All right, sorry about this, guys. All right, I'm going to give you a quick introduction and then I'm going to let you get started. So if you just give me a few minutes.
Awesome.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lifelong learning lecture. And first thing I'm going to do is ask any of you who are not muted already, if you could please mute yourself to avoid that unintended interruption of other background noises. All right, so tonight we are very pleased to have with us, and I'm going to mute a few people, I'm afraid. All right, so once again, welcome to tonight's Lifelong Learning lecture. We are very pleased to have with us Jerome Burke, Director, Center for Inclusive Excellence at Framingham State University. He's here to talk tonight about Open Pages, Open Minds, countering book bans through dialogues. And once again, if you haven't already, please mute yourselves. I will mute you if you do not mute yourself. I am going to be dropping into tonight's chat a link to our evaluation form, and we welcome any comments you have about tonight's lectures, and along with any ideas you have for future lectures that you'd like us to consider. Q&A tonight will take place throughout. So if you have a question for Jerome, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We will break to answer any questions at any time. So don't hesitate to ask any. And with that, I want to welcome Jerome and hand it over to you.
All right. Awesome. Good night, everyone. I'm deeply honored to be here tonight and to share about something that I became passionate about. This was an area that was brought to me. And so I'm going to start with a little story. So Jerome Burke served as the director for the Center for Inclusive Excellence. I joined Framingham State University in June 2023. Prior to that, I was working in Jamaica. I migrated to the US in December of 2021. A part of my introduction to Framingham, my vice president, Dr. Jeffrey Coldman, he would have tasked me in terms of like reaching out to other departments and connecting and finding ways that I would be able to work along with various departments. One such team that I met with was the librarians, right? We have the Whitmore Library at Framingham State University. And we had like a deep conversation around what's happening in terms of our students and literature and how it is that we can identify where there are areas of concern and what it is that we can do in terms of like being very programmatic and practical in terms of what's happening. And we started having a conversations around like book bans, right? I don't think like in Jamaica, I don't think that this was something that was on my radar, to be honest. This was not something that I might have seen it in terms of globally, but it was never something that was showing up at home. So it's one of those things where you're like, oh, it's not at your doorstep, so why do you even care? But at that time when we're having this conversation, again, and this presentation will bring that to the fore. We realized that a lot that this was happening a lot. And as much as we live in what we like to describe as a liberal Massachusetts, we thought that it would have been important in terms of looking at this and addressing this. So thus we formed a program called Diversity Dialogue as a way to look at books and materials that have been banned or challenged and provide an avenue to talk about that. This presentation was one that was developed to do at NCORE, which is the National Convention on Race and Ethnicity, because there was a call for persons to do presentations at that conference. So fortunately for myself, myself and my vice president, we were able to go to Hawaii. So bragging a little bit, we were able to go to Hawaii and share and talk about this initiative that we were able to do on our campus and what it is that we were seeing when we were looking at the topics surrounding book ban. So we can go to the next slide. I think we're going to look at the objectives. Okay. In terms of the objectives of this particular presentation, I want to explore the historical context of book bans, censorship, and challenges to intellectual freedoms in educational settings. I also want to talk about disproportionate targeting of books that advocate for marginalized communities, and also talk a little about some of the actionable strategies that we can implement in our own spaces to combat book banning, especially within educational institutions, right? So next slide. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with Framingham, so again, this has become my safe space. This has become not just my job, but really and truly my community, my safe space. It's Framingham State University. It's located in Framingham, Massachusetts, about 20 miles outside of Boston. A big part of the mission of the institution and why I was really drawn to working at this institution is that it's committed to providing affordable, high quality education to all qualified students and maintaining a commitment to student involvement, engagement, and academic excellence. And myself being a first generation, meaning that I would have been the first from my family to have gone to tertiary institution or get tertiary education. This was something that was important to me in terms of how it is that I could make sure that I was aligning with an organization or an institution that was passionate about the things that I am also passionate about. Some other information, if we could go to the next slide, about Framingham is that the 2023 data showed that we had a population of a little bit over 4,000 students. Our undergraduate program included over 2,800 students. Our graduate program included over 1,211 students with over 44 majors. We have a full-time faculty of over 165, part-time of over 129, and a total staff of over 347. So a lot of this information is from 2023. So maybe there's been a little change, but in an essence, that paints a good picture of what our makeup looks like. Next slide. In terms of our student demographic, I know this may be a little hard to look at, but in terms of our student population, we see where over 52.8% of our students identified as being white. Over 20.6% of our students identify as being Hispanic or Latino, and 16.8% of our students identify as being Black, 4.5% as being Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and 3.5 identifying as being Asian, right? So also this information was important to me as I start my job in terms of a big part of my role, which I will get into next in terms of next slide, in terms of what we do at the CIE. So the Center for Inclusive Excellence, where I serve as a director, it's really a hub, right? It's actually a physical space on campus that's dedicated to DEI programming and really a space where we can explore the intersecting identities of our students, right? It's we work really alongside students who have been historically marginalized and underrepresented. So again, thinking back to the slide before in terms of when you see that breakdown in terms of over 20.6% 15.6% of our students identifying as being Hispanic, 16.8% identify as being Black. We recently did a census, and I know in just overall in terms of our BIPOC community, which is our Black and Indigenous student of color, now stands at 49%, right? 51% of our students identify as being white, but over 49% identifying as being BIPOC. So this is a physical space that is dedicated to really looking at some of those issues for our students from our BIPOC communities and how it is that we can bridge those gaps. So a lot of the work that I do centers around that. Next slide. All right, so this is why we're here in terms of talking about book banning. What is book banning? And I think the best place to start anytime you're looking at any conversation or topic is really with some definitions, right? And the definition that I'm using when we talk about ban is the actual restriction of access to that material, right? So according to the American Library Association, they said that book banning is the act of removing material from a school's or library's collection as a result of objection from groups or individuals who say they need to protect others, typically children, right? So this is what we generally accept as the definition of a ban. So it's that you're really and truly removing it. When we talk about a challenge now, where it refers to attempt to remove or restrict access to the material, be it a book, a video, based on an individual's group's objection. And what we have also seen is something that where we have termed soft censorship, when books are removed or they never make it to the shelf to avoid conflict. Some of the things that we see when we're talking about soft censorship, right? We see where there have been attempts, they're separating books based on their titles. So they will do things like, we will generally classify this as a children's book, but they may take it and put it in the adult section, right? So you have persons who work in particular areas that have these materials, whether there be librarians or you have persons who will go into the library and hide these books. So we have seen the more and more we talk to our librarians, our persons who are in positions where these materials exist, these are some of the things that we're seeing. I just want to say if at this time anyone has any questions or comment, I am able to take those at this point. If not, I will just continue. Person? All right. So one of the next slide, looking at what exists in Massachusetts. So again, I started the conversation by asking the team, like, what exists in Massachusetts? Why do we, is there any response to what's happening in the other states? Are we concerned about this, or are we just sitting and waiting until it shows up at our doorstep, right? And fortunately, we have seen where Massachusetts is actually ahead of the game, or actually trying to make sure that it doesn't show up in our state as we have seen it in others. Not to say that there are books and materials that are possibly being challenged in Massachusetts, but there's actually legislation that have been introduced to counteract this. So we have seen where the Freedom to Read Act, which was introduced in December 2023 by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. And this act is calling on all primary and secondary schools to have a trained librarian. It requires all public school libraries to maintain a diverse collection of books, right? And by diverse collection of books, it does give a definition of what diverse means. It classifies discriminatory book bans as violations of federal and civil rights laws, and the Government Accountable Office to report of the effect of book bans on underrepresented communities. So that's the purpose of the Book Save Lives Act that was introduced by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. We also see where there is the Senate bill, right, from Senator Jake Oliveira, and shout out to him because he's a FSU alum. So he introduced this particular bill, and it's meant to protect against attempts to ban or remove or restrict materials or access to materials in our library. And lastly, what I saw through the research was that there was also a MA Senate Bill 2528, which was introduced by another senator, and the bill intends to provide more freedom of expression in school. This would extend to library collections, and yeah, so really, that's what I've seen that exists. I'm not sure if there's further legislative attempts, but so far, that's what I would have found in my research. And in terms of the next slide, the historical context of book banning, right? So before there was the banning of book, there was the burning of books, right? So how much of us are familiar with sometimes with in terms of what we see on our media with books literally being burned, right? So again, I try to do a deep dive to say what does history show? What does history present when we're talking about book banning, right? And we see where in 1640, during the Common Era, there was a caliph who burned over 200,000 volumes of book in the library at Alexandria in Egypt, right? And this was really because he found that the books, he considered the books not to be in keeping with their religious beliefs. That's really what it was. And people said that there were so many books that burned that it literally provided what you call it, like heat during the cold period because there were so much books that were being burnt. Moving on, we saw during 1524 and 2026, thousand copies of the William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament were printed in Germany and smuggled into England, where they were publicly burned in 1526 by order of London's Roman Catholic bishop. And then in 1933, a series of massive bonfires in Nazi Germany, Nazis in Germany burned thousands of books written by Jews, communists, and others. So again, these are some of the things that we see when we think about where history has gone and history has shown that a lot, and it's so interesting. Like sometimes when you turn on media and you see where persons are now doing this, you're like, hey, we were once here. Like, and this is why I think in terms of documentation, the very book that they're burning, this is why it's important for us to provide documentation. And when people talk about why they are concerned about certain things is because once upon a time there we were actually experiencing these things. Next slide. Okay, so the empty library. So there's a note on it that the empty library by the Israeli sculptor. And you can find this in Berlin, Germany. It's dedicated to remembering the Nazi book burnings, right, which took place on May 10, 1993. And written on it says, that was but a prelude. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. And that's scary, right? And I think that's both figuratively and literal, right? In terms of understanding that where we have seen where people have gone out of their ways to antagonize particular groups, some of the treatment that they give to literature and certain materials, the idea is that very soon we'll see these start showing up in terms of how it is that they treat people, actual people. So some of the stories that they are trying to hide, when we will further in the presentation, we will look at some of the groups and some of the books that are often banned. But you realize that the same way that they treat these materials are some of the same treatment that are meted out to persons who are living these actual experiences. Again, if anyone has any question at any point, feel free to open your mic and ask. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, awesome. All right, so again, just looking in terms of the history of book banning in the US. So in 1637, one of the first books that were banned was by Thomas Martin. It's the New English Canon. And it says that this was primarily, so this was banned for several reasons, primarily because it criticized the Puritan society, right? So Martin was a staunch critic of the religious and just the lifestyle of the Puritans, and he created this satire work, and he spoke to the hypocrisy and the treatment that was meted out to indigenous people. He also advocated for a more liberal and a less authoritarian society, and because of this, the governance didn't appreciate this, right? So as you can imagine, in 1637, so that was one of the first books that we saw being banned in the US in terms of what I thought in terms of the research. Then there was the Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, written by Harriet Beecher. And this was banned by the Confederacy for its strong anti-slavery message, right? So again, it depicted the brutalities and the reality of slavery and it had a profound and emotional impact on the readers, particularly those up north, right? And that's how they would describe it, those up north. So because of that, we saw where this book started shaping opinions around slavery. So there was a ban on it. And then there was the 1873 Comstock Act, right? Named after an anti-vice crusader. It was a federal law that banned the distribution of what they describe as anything obscene or lewd, right? And by this, it particularly targeted pamphlet and publication deemed to promoting what they call immorals. And those were things that looked at any particular materials around like abortions and things around dealing with like pro-woman methods, right? So again, these were some of the things that we would have seen as we look at the history of book banning in America. So we go to the next slides. Oh,
I see a hand up.
Awesome.
Mary.
Mary?
Yeah, the banning of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, if it was done by the Confederacy, why that wouldn't affect the whole United States, would it?
In terms of, okay, so that's something that I could delve deeper in terms of, but one of the things as we realize with book bans that sometimes it doesn't show up in terms of like what we see happening statewide, right? You see where states and different states would enact these bans because again, that's one way of controlling it, and that's one way of trying to make sure that these messages were limited. So it might not have been a nationwide ban, but in terms of the chilling effect of it, right? In terms of creating conversations around pulling these materials, right? So we saw one of the conversations I had with the librarians, right? So again, you might see where a particular book is banned in Florida, right? Not banned in Massachusetts. And again, just practical examples of some of the conversation that came out of this exercise. And you have persons who may have very conservative views and they follow that type of particular news outlet, so they are in tune with those conversations. So one of the things that they would have done is that they're able to know if they see this book in any public space, even in a state that the state that they're living in, even though it's not banned in their state, they do maybe soft censorship. So they would go in and pull these books from the shelves or try to encourage others not to read it or try to, so there were some of that happening in spaces or states where the books weren't banned.
Thank you.
No problem. So in terms of like legislation and book banning, there's a particular case called I think the first one that we're looking at is the United States and one book called Ulysses. So it was a publication prior to the publication in the Little Review. One chapter include a scene about masturbation, right? When the magazine was sent to subscribers, a girl of an unknown age was shocked and complained to the Manhattan DA about this. The magazine publishers, both women, argued that the book should be considered as a whole, right? So what we saw happening was that around 1993, so a lot of these books, they were not published entirely. They were sent in magazine and they would provide like a chapter upon chapter upon chapter. So in one particular chapter, in one particular publication of this magazine, there was a scene that they found are considered disturbing, right? And when they brought this case, the publishers were like, hey, if you take this by itself, I can understand why you may be concerned about it, but that's not how books are generally meant to be read, right? And again, we can see where this happens a lot, right? Where you will write an entire book that has 600-700 pages, and people will go in and they will find one page, two words, and because of that, they're asking that it be pulled from shelves, right? So fast forward to 1932, when Random House gained publishing rights of the same book in its entirety after sending it through custom to set up a test. It was eventually heard by a judge. He ruled that the book was, as a whole, was not obscene and was an amazing use of the stream of consciousness. So what came out of that ruling, the 1933 ruling, was that these materials should not be taken in parts, but it should be taken as the true intention of the writers as a whole, in terms of to be able to tell the entire story. Because if you do that, if you're able to pull one line and two words or just one chapter, it may give this notion that it's obscene, or right, and we see where a lot of the narrative, and again, just trying to be very practical about it. This is how we see that these conversations go. This is what we're seeing when persons are having these conversations. A lot of the books that are being challenged, a lot of the materials that are being pulled, generally they're zoning in on just one particular area. I also look at Board of Education versus Pico, 1982. So in September 1975, 11 titles were removed from a high school library in New York City public school after receiving a list of material from parents in New York, a conservative activist group. The top 9 titles were removed from the high school. The following book was removed from a junior high school, while the final title was removed from an English curriculum. When the school board was asked why anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy, that's how they described it, right? So 6 students brought a case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won their case and had all 11 titles returned, right? And then what came out of this was that when it comes to what is considered a person's right to receive information, a library setting under the First Amendment, leading to a lot of the issues we've overcome in the last. So again, what took place with this is that they saw these books and they described them as being anti-American, anti-Christian, right? And the students pushed back and said that that's not true. That's really and truly not true. And not only that, pulling these books goes against our First Amendment rights in terms of like freedom of expression, and the judge actually ruled in their favor. So that's some of the there's a lot more legislations around this. That's something that I've been interested in, and my first degree is in law, so that's something that coming out of this exercise, I'm like, I think I want to be able to like delve some more into these cases. In terms of the next slide, right, I kind of did an exercise where I looked at the top 10 most banned books of 2023. Right, and these are the 10 we see at number 10 sold, and this was the reason why this was banned in a number of the states was because and school districts, sorry, there was claim that it was too sexually explicit. Yeah, number 9, let's talk about it. Right, let's talk about it. The Teen's Guide to Sex, Relationships, and Being a Human. Right, and it deals with issues around LGBTQ, sexual education, right? You can go to the next slide. In terms of number 8, again, book that deals with LGBTQ issues. Number 7, Dying Girl. It was banned for saying that it had profanity. You can continue. Okay, in terms of the others, The Bluest Eyes, Flamer, again, issues dealing with LGBTQ issues. Continue. Number 4 and number 3, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. Again, we see the depiction of sexual abuse, LGBTQ content. This book is gay. It's really the name of this book. And again, and 71 challenges and described as being too sexually explicit. It dealt with issues around the LGBTQ community. And then you could go to the next slide. All boys aren't blue for LGBTQ content considered too sexually explicit. And the number one in 2023 was genderqueer for LGBTQ content, right? So I'm sure we're seeing a pattern. So where do these challenges take place, right? And again, I try to delve a little bit deeper in terms of to see what was what existed, and we saw that there were pressure groups in 2023 focused on public libraries in addition to targeting school libraries. The number of titles targeted for censorship at public libraries increased by 92% over the previous year, accounting for about 46 of all book challenges in 2023. Right, we saw where there was the challenges were happening like at about 54% of the challenges took place in public libraries, around 39% took place in school libraries, around 5% took place at school, and this included books or topics in the curriculum. And we saw where there were 2% that took place specifically in higher education libraries, right? So this is where we're seeing a lot of the challenges. So when we're saying like, these challenges sometimes, because again, I was just like, I see a lot happening around book ban and challenges. So where it is that we were seeing that these were happening and how it is that these were affecting the community. And I thought about this again in a very practical sense, like how many of us live close to a library in our community? I live on Main Street in Worcester, right? I live literally walking distance from the library in Worcester, right? And I know that the library is a space where a lot of kids go to. There are a lot of marginalized or communities that feeds into our library, right? A lot of times parents are not able to maybe buy these materials, so they will. I remember like growing up in Jamaica, and a lot of the books that I would have read was me going to a public library, right? A lot of the words that I was transported to what came from me picking up a book and reading, right? And so this again was something that I found to be very personal, like thinking about a number of these books being challenged at public libraries. I found that to be deeply concerning. And I'm also thinking about students who identify as being queer, right? So not being confident enough at that age to maybe be reading this book at home, right? So you know that you may go to a library, right? You have not already have that talk with your family members or friends. So a library sometimes is your safe space that you're able to go and read and educate yourself and enjoy these materials. So again, these are some of the reasons why it's very concerning. Next slide. Who initiates these challenges, right? So prior to 2020, an individual parent who sought to remove or restrict access to a book their child was reading. Recent data shows that over 28% of persons who initiate challenges are just like patrons. Then you have like 24% being parents. You have like 21% being pressure groups, right? So people have been, it goes from individuals to people being really, really organized and being very passionate about getting books off shelves. One of the conversations I remember having with the librarians about this, and they say that because a lot of times you have persons who are not really involved in their school district, they don't run to be on particular committees, right? And you have others who know that, right? So you have policies that are implemented and they have like very chilling effect. And when you think about it, you have like 15 people or sometimes even less than that showing up to these committee meetings, and they are making pronouncements or they're able to vote and pass these policies that are affecting large school districts, but because others are not turning up. And again, there are some there are some issues to that too, in terms of some of the conversations when I had conversations about that, and why sometimes these pressure groups are able to really have success when they do this. Because one, we're talking about stories for marginalized groups and books being banned from marginalized groups, right? And some of these families, how many families we know that their parents are working a lot of time when these meetings are taking place, right? Some parents have 2 and 3 jobs, right? Not able to commit to being on these particular committees, right? To push back and fight against, right? So others just knowing this and able to exploit the very rules, bend the very rules to serve their benefit, sometimes is very concerning, and something that when we were talking about this and kind of drilling down to understand why this was happening, was something that we saw. So is it just books that are being banned? No. Right? So again, this is why we have to be concerned. So the data did show that a lot of, and I think that is why the media oftentimes concentrates so much on it, because the data does show that the books are what we're seeing that are being heavily targeted. But we also see where there were like magazines, right? We saw where there were certain social media pages, there were certain particular music. We saw displays and exhibits, right? I think I remember, and don't quote me on this, but I think there is a group or an individual in Worcester, and I can only speak to what I know, so that way I can be factual about this, called Turtle Boy, right? And he has been and I think he does like a lot of like, how do I describe it? Like publication or articles. And oftentimes they will go to cultural exhibits, or there are exhibits that happen in Worcester. I'm not sure if he does anything outside of Worcester, but I know what he does, and then he will write these things and try to push a narrative that these things should be removed or challenged, right? So I do know from my own experience where I've seen that as well. So, and there's actually films that have been banned again, and we have seen this when they deal with particular topics. And censorship is on the rise, right? In terms of, when you go to the next slide. Yes. So according to the American Library Association, over 4,240 works in school and public libraries were targeted in 2023, a jump from the old record of nearly 2,600 books in 2022, right? So this is very concerning again. So this is what it was just the data behind it that kind of pulled me into this, in terms of saying like something is happening here, trying to understand, which I kind of tried to capture in this presentation, what was the historical context of this, and we're here now, right? And we see where on a yearly basis this is increasing. I'm gonna have to update this presentation to see in terms of, and as early 2025, I'm gonna have to update this presentation to see what took place in 2024, right? But the conversations around book ban very much continues and remains alive. I then look at what were happening in particular states, and which states were being the leaders in book banning, and which states were priding themselves on this. And we saw in Florida that there were over 1,406 titles that were banned, and in Texas, over 625, Missouri and Utah, Pennsylvania, and it continues, right? And one of the things that I found very concerning about this, in terms of some of the narratives around this, in terms of elected officials, they are able to use this to as a political score. They literally, I've seen videos, I've seen articles where they proudly talk about banning this, banning books, right? And they will say, in my state, we have been able to remove this. Like, there seemingly it started out where it was being done at a small scale, and we may be doing this and we're doing it in the dark, but this has now come to the fore, and they've literally gone to the microphones and saying that they're doing this and they're proud of this. That's something too that I find to be very concerning, where they're able to use this as a way to gain political score. the stories we tell our children, right? So we know that books are being banned. So what are the stories that we're telling our children? Well, so we know that these one of the I looked at a paper, a writing from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, and it was a short article titled Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors, and it was written in 1990, over 34 years ago. And she wrote about children needing stories that are windows that eventually turn into sliding doors that would allow them to live different experience from their own lived experience. And again, that's something that I speak to, or something I relate to, sorry. And how many of us can relate to that? I'm sure, like those of us who are into reading and just enjoy literature, you're able to go to a place by taking up a particular book, right? And sometimes these become places that we're interested to eventually visit because of the stories and because of the novels that we would have read, right? So again, and she wrote it, our concern was that a lot of the books that she was seeing weren't reflecting, students were not, or young people were not seeing themselves in the stories that they were reading, all right? And I looked at diversity in children's book in 2018, and as you saw, and again, this is what the numbers show, and I think it was important for me to use data a lot through this presentation in terms of just talking about what I was seeing and why it is that I found it to be so concerning and alarming. In terms of the children literature that existed in 2018, it found that 50% of them had a white character as the lead, right? In terms of the main character, we saw where 27% of them had like an animal. There was only 10% having African American, 7% Asian Pacific. We saw 5% as being Latinx and 1% being American and Indians, right? So again, when you put that, when you look at it in terms of just numbers, what is it that exists for our students to read? Why is it that we know that there has been a real push in terms of when you think about even some of the fairy tales, right? When you think about even the Little Mermaid and who was originally the lead, right? And even the backlash when they used a Black character or a Black actress for the lead, there was a lot of conversation about, oh, you're changing the story. This is not what I grew up knowing. Even when it's a fairy tale, even when it's it's fictional, people are sometimes so angry about this, right? And my flip to that is that is why it's important that minority groups are able to see themselves as leads, and they're able to see themselves in positions and in these stories. The stories that we're telling our children, it's very important that authors are able to write and able to publish stories with minority groups in a position of power. Next slide. In terms of who are the targets of book bans, I think I saw, and some of these, in terms, we saw where 48% of them include themes of instances of violence and abuse, right? So we saw where stories that maybe dealt with issues around sexual violence, stories that dealt with issues of sexual abuse, and which upon interpretation really looks at issues around like women empowerment are needing to address particular legislation, right? So some of the times we go to a place of, oh, this is too lewd and this is too crass, not appreciating the greater narrative or the greater objective or purpose of these literature, right? We saw some of the books that have been challenged disproportionately, books that deal with issues around health and well-being, right? And those that dealt with characters of a particular color and particular race. We saw a lot of the books, again, even the top 10 that we looked at, right? A lot of those dealt with LGBTQ characters or LGBTQ themes, right? So again, these are some of the books that we see that continues to be challenged disproportionately. Next slide. Why should we be concerned about this? Is it that Uh, it's because it's gonna have an impact, really and truly. And it's gonna have an impact on us, it's gonna have an impact on our children. So in terms of the literature and the data around this, I saw where they were writing saying that some of the impact of book ban is stifles critical thinking, right? Oh, we need materials that is able to disrupt our regular beliefs, right? Why is it that I only believe that this can only go this way, right? Because we grew up in an environment where we were told that these are the type of person that exist in leadership, right? But if we are able to give our students and our children materials where they're able to understand and learn about other groups and learn about other ethnicity and learn about other culture, right? So that they can broaden their critical thinking. I think that's good, right? But when we're banning these books, it will have the opposite impact. Because emotional suppression, again, some of these books, they look at dealing with emotions and talking about speaking up, right? It reduces empathy, right? Because if we're not able to highlight some of the plights of our neighbors and some of the plights of our communities, people are not going to be able to empathize and understand some of the issues that other groups face. Impacts on school, diminish educational quality, curriculum restriction, and overall a chilling effect, right? Just imagine professors, teachers wanting to teach about a particular topic and have to be spending time researching whether or not this is a particular book that they can introduce in their classroom, right? Or having for years upon years using a particular material and then they're told that, hey, you have to pull this from your curriculum. And if you think about this in terms of chilling effect, people may just start saying like, hey, I am just fearful that I'm going to lose my job, so I'm just not going to do this. Either you're going to want to leave the profession overall, or you're just going to be like, hey, I'm just not going to address this topic overall. I'm not bringing this to my classroom anymore because I'm just scared. Impact on the society, erosion of democracy, and increased polarization. Yes. Next slide. So strategies for counteracting book bans, and here I can talk about what it is that we would have done. So again, we started a program called Diversity Dialogues. What this did was that it originally, so bear with me, originally coming out of the conversation and developing and doing the research, we looked at a book called The 57 Bus, right? So the idea was that what I wanted a book that was banned in some states and were being challenged or challenged in some states. And we looked at a book called The 57 Bus. It's non-fictional, it highlights a character, they're non-binary, and it deals with a bunch of issues around like social justice, policing, it deals with LGBTQ issues. Yeah, so those were some of the topics in it. So what we wanted to do was that not force people to read the book and come to a space and talk, but highlight the themes within that particular book and talk about them, right? So in terms of looking at as a strategy, right? What are the themes that we're seeing in books that have been banned and challenged? So that's one of the strategies that I would encourage anyone to implement as you think about this. How it is that you can maybe in your own way, in your own space, look at some of the materials that have been banned and challenged, and how can you create spaces that you can really talk about these issues and topics. So even if you're not reading the books yourself, or even if you can't get people to read them, I'm sure that persons are able to talk about these themes broadly. And forming what we did was to form partnerships with on-campus and community libraries. So again, just thinking about how it is that you can get support or give support. And lastly, I like banned books, right? One of the things that we found to be interesting is that a lot of the books that are banned or challenged is that a lot of time when they come to the fore in the media, or a lot of times when persons are told that, oh, did you know that this is a particular book that has been banned? People for some reason are drawn to it, right? And even you can think about the child in you in terms of when it is that your parents say, don't do this, don't look at this. For some reason, you become more curious, right? So that's also an approach in terms of in your community, in your space, or it is that you can bring to the attention of others in terms of saying, hey, I think you should try to get all of this. I think it was a good read. And also in terms of like ordering these books and these materials, it's a way to support authors who sometimes who care about these issues and feel so burdened and feel so stressed in terms of continuing to tell these stories. But if it is that we're in a space where we can personally buy their books, I think it will encourage them to continue because at least they continue to have like a financial benefit. Next slide. So this just talks a little bit about the development of diversity dialogue, the series that we did. A part of the series, one of the things that we did with the series too, as we continue to grow, is that we brought in like knowledgeable speakers, content experts that were able to facilitate and guide those conversations. And I just honestly believe that I'm really at a place where I'm living out some of the opportunities that I missed when I was in higher education. So I'm someone who oftentimes I really like partnership. I really like working with individuals and I really like interacting with people who I just really believe are way smarter than myself because I'm at a stage where I'm a sponge where I'm just trying to soak up and absorb as much information as I can. So that's something that I would encourage individuals to do as well if it is that there are particular topics or themes or areas that you'd want to explore but you are not in a position to really talk about this from a place of being informed. I can tell you that there are oftentimes persons out there that are willing and they're very able to do this. I've interacted with persons who have done it for free. They just want to come and share. And I've also interacted with persons who may ask for an honorarium or stipend, but they exist. And we've created like monthly spaces, 1 hour sessions that we're able to really focus on this. So not allowing people to commit too much of their time, but just creating some structure around diversity dialogue. So persons have something to look forward to and come into a space and share. Next slide. So these are some of the persons that I would have. These were some of the topics that we would have looked at, and these were some of the persons who would have come to our campus and presented. We did conversations around reparations, right? We know that that's a very political thing, whether or not your person should get reparations, or would we go about reparations if it was supposed to be done, right? What was interesting in that space, I remember Lawrence when he came and he was talking about it, and he was like, you know that and it was like, oh, do you know that they're able to, if you meet in an accident and you have an injury, they're able to calculate how much it is if you broke a finger, if you lose an arm, they're literally calculation behind that, right? So it's like people have accepted that and have done that. So they have mechanism that we all have accepted on a day-to-day basis, right? So when you think about reparations and people say, oh, it can't be done, or is it that we're going to know to do it? It's like, it can be done. And there have been a lot of materials and there have been a lot of conversations showing how you can go about identifying groups. But again, so these are some of the spaces that we have created, and these are some of the things that I find to be very intriguing and interesting as we think about like diversity dialogue and looking at some of the themes and books that have been banned. We looked at issues around like the model minority myth, and we brought someone on campus who was able to talk about that, look on some of the materials that dealt with that as well. So these have been some of the conversations that we've been having as well as some of the presenters that we have brought to campus thus far. Next slide. You can go to next slide. Okay, and again, these are just some of the images for some of the spaces that we have held as well. So we try to make it as interactive, and we sometimes again we try. So we in the presentation I spoke about some exhibits being banned or exhibits being challenged. As you can see, one of the persons I worked with, I was like Could you bring an exhibit as well to be a part of that? I see. What is the model minority myth? Okay, so when we talk about the model minority myth, it's the belief that particular groups, there are certain stereotypes that are attached to those groups. So especially with the Asian community, right? We see where the belief is that all Asians are good at math. They're good at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, right? So, but in that space, one of the things that I was able to learn is that sometimes this can be extremely problematic and difficult for students of Asian identity, right? Because we go in thinking that they should be the smart ones. So whenever there's a group assignment, we turn and we're like, you answer that question, or you're going to be assigned that part, right? And they feel like if they're one at home, they may have a mom or dad that's working in the field of science, and they're already dealing with that at home to say like, oh, this is not necessarily a field that I want to pursue, right? Or is that I'm going to have this conversation with my parents, and at school, people are putting that pressure on them already and again, right? So it's just these stereotypes and these myths that we believe about minority groups. And oftentimes allow them to feel very stifled and feel it gives them. I remember the presenter talking about it and just talking about for herself. Oh, this was something extremely difficult. She was like, I was terrible math student, right? And this was something that I struggled with my family because most of my family were from scientific background. And then I was dealing with this at home, but I was also dealing with it with my friends at school because they just expected me to be good at this. Yeah. All right. I think these are the some of the where I got some of the research that I would have done and where I would have gotten some of the information that I spoke to throughout the presentation. Okay. Thanks for bearing thanks for everyone for bearing with me. I will take comments at this time.
All right, thank you so much, Jerome. And we do have a question in the chat right now. And the question is, what is the model minority myth?
Oh, I think that's what I just spoke to in terms of explaining that it generally speaks to the stereotypes that are placed on minority groups and believing that they must operate from a place of success. So I was giving reference to the Asian communities, thinking that all Asians are good at science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Allowing individuals who actually are not good at that from that particular group or community, then we're saying that they're not a true reflection of that community. It's that general belief.
Now, I've certainly have heard this quite a bit because as an Asian myself, that is a stereotype that we have imposed on us. But are there similar myths that are applied to other groups that you're aware of?
I do think there is. I'm not sure if we would categorize it the same. I do remember being in spaces and it's almost expecting that Black people should be athletic too. So it's those general stereotypes that we attach to people from time to time. But I think a lot of times it shows up when I did not that it's only for one group, but a lot of the research or conversation that I saw was attached to the Asian community.
Okay. All right, I'm going to repeat a question that may have been answered earlier, so I apologize if it was, but what is the meaning of hate crime on the slide titled More Than Books? So if further back, I can try to pull up the slide if I can. Let me see if I can.
Okay. I'm wondering if it was one of the slides I was saying that books that looked at issues dealing with hate crimes. Maybe that's what it would have meant.
Yeah, I feel like that's where we saw it. So not
So-
just books, that was the slide, and 4% hate crimes.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I represented that well. Yeah, I think broadly talking about materials or any any materials or publication that dealt with anything around hate crime. We saw that there was concern, there were censorship or banning or challenge around those as well. So whether it be through exhibits, whether it be through drawings, whether it be through films, that was something that was shown in the data as well. But I specifically wanted to pull that out, why that was reflected there.
Okay. And I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, you're certainly welcome to either drop it in the chat or if you want to raise your hand in the in Zoom, you're welcome to do that and we can call on you. But while we're waiting for that, Jerome, I do have a question for you. So actually, sorry, we just got a question come in. So Mary, I'm going to let you go. If you would like to take yourself off mute, you're welcome to ask your question.
The slide where you showed the states and the number of bans, were those, was that number attempted or successful?
Those were successful. Those were the amount of that were actually successful.
Wow, that's pretty high for Florida.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So that's what's concerning for us. And again, that's what in terms of like trying to understand why our executive leaders, elected leaders, sorry, our elected leaders dealing with this. And again, the data seemingly, and the narrative was seemingly that they're operating from a place of being very proud about this. This was something that was now scoring political points. This was something that was now saying to families, especially in conservative areas, that look, see what I have done, and I can provide you with this list. And also having pressure groups, a lot of pressure groups in these communities or these states, sorry, was what we were seeing.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Jerome, I have a question for you as well. And referring back to your slide about diversity in children's books and the breakdown that you had where you've got a 50% white characters and then a breakdown further, how much of that breakdown is a reflection of the writer themselves? And if it's a reflection of the writer, so a white writer writing about white children, for instance, how much of that is changing in the book publishing industry that you may be aware of?
Okay, so that's a very, very good question. That's something that I must admit that I didn't drill down on to see, like, were these are these children book only written by white author? But in terms of the diversity, what I can say, especially in terms of a lot of conversations and work around DEI, I know that there has been a skyrocketing in terms of the amount of diverse literature and that has been published around focusing on children, right? I think there's a children literature actually happening on campus today. Maybe and Roberta can speak to that. That's actually happening on our campus today, and there has been a real thrust, especially university or campuses that have been dedicated to like DEI work, and by that I mean diversity, equity, and inclusion work. In terms of pulling materials or really working with authors that provide diverse stories or stories of minority groups. So there has been a growing number of that. When I look at even, I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with like The View, that TV, what do you call it? That TV
Talk
show.
show. Yeah,
Yeah, that
the
talk
talk
show
show.
that The View does a lot of conversation, promote like a lot of book, right? And they have been like really intentional about even highlighting like diverse authors and titles and literature. So there has been a push in terms of trying to tell more of these stories, to be honest, over the last couple of years. But you can imagine that based on recent development, there are concerns that there may be more challenge and bans coming.
Mhm.
So it's one of those things where we have seen over the last couple of years where it has swung one direction, but are we about to see it swinging back too?
Okay. All right. I'm kind of curious. Do you think Oprah's book club has helped in any way?
Oh yes. Yeah. Oh yes, I think again it's the same idea in terms of what I would have mentioned with the view. Oprah has been very dedicated and been very committed to working with diverse author. I think that's something that we can all credit her for doing. And she has platformed a lot of underrepresented author and really given them the opportunity to be for their work to get out there. And I think one of the things that is important, especially with the work that Oprah does, is in terms of like the financial benefit, right? For stories to for these stories to continue to be shared and to be told, authors needs to be paid, right? Because when you think about writing a book, I've never written a book, but I can only imagine, right? Even just putting a presentation like this together, it may take you so much time in terms of just the research. So like putting a book together and that are looking at various identities can take so much time, right? So it can be very disheartening when you're putting in the work and your books are being banned or challenged or there's some form of soft censorship and then not being paid, right? So when you think about the work that Oprah does, it's not just only highlighting them, but also providing them an opportunity for people to be able to actually buy these books and to encourage the author to continue to tell these stories.
Mhm. Great. Well, Jerome, I think we've taken up so much of your time. We're already past 8 o'clock as it is. But this has been a terrific talk. Just a lot of great information that you've shared and such an important topic, especially in this day and age where I think more of these, protests against certain books have been coming up. And I can't say enough about, how much I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you all so much. Again, one of the things that this particular exercise has taught me is like use data to support your point, right? We were talking about books being banned, right? And as I talk about it, I felt like through the process of it, I was just like hearing things that were seemingly just like coming and going, right? But for me, for it to make sense and for it to maybe convince someone, not that you're not necessarily trying to pick an argument or trying to win, but for you to have some amount of ground or legs to stand on, I will encourage anyone that's interested in doing any form of research around this, please utilize data to be a part of your conversation. So again, talk about how many books, literal numbers in terms of how many books we see being banned in particular states, talk about how many books we see being published or just with certain leads just being of a particular identity, right? Those numbers are important. And I think sometimes that's what's going to be very jerking to people, because that's when I started going down this rabbit hole, when I was like, oh my God, the numbers, oh my God, the numbers. So and again, I'm not good at math. I'm not someone who like math and numbers, but for some reason, numbers can really tell a story. So that's something I would encourage as we continue to deal with any social justice issue that we're passionate about. Use numbers to be a part of your story.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really great talk. Very important topic. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right,
Thank you for
everybody,
joining tonight.
everyone.
And I hope you join us again next week. We've got Dr. Smales coming to talk about the recent election this week. All right. Hope to see you all again. And everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you.